Everett Colston was the kind of man who fixed things before they broke, not because he was a perfectionist. Because he had learned early, and at considerable cost, that waiting for something to fall apart was always more expensive than maintaining it. He had built his whole life around that principle: his contracting business, his friendships, his faith, his marriage of 19 years to a woman named Adelaide. But for the past 11 months, something in that marriage had been failing. And for the first time in his life, Everett did not know where to begin looking for the crack. Before he came home that Tuesday evening in late November, he had made a decision. Quiet, deliberate, final. The kind of decision a man arrives at not in a single moment of anger, but after months of smaller moments that stack up until the weight becomes impossible to carry. He had spoken to an attorney 3 weeks earlier, had separated a portion of their savings, carefully and without bitterness, had written a letter, 3 drafts before he got it right, explaining that he still respected her, that none of this was coming from hatred, that he simply could not keep living inside a silence he did not understand and had not consented to. The letter was in his jacket pocket when he pulled into the driveway. He sat in his truck for a long moment before going inside. The porch light was on. Adelaide always left the porch light on, even now, even after everything between them had gone cold. That detail had always meant something to him. He wasn't sure what it meant anymore. He came in through the kitchen door. The house smelled like the cedar candle she kept on the windowsill above the sink. He had given her that candle on their 15th anniversary. He stood very still in the doorway and let himself feel that for exactly 1 second. Then he set his keys on the counter and heard her voice. She was in the back room, the small reading room off the hallway that she had converted into an office when she started working from home. The door was not fully closed. Her voice came through the gap, low and steady. The voice of someone holding themselves together with both hands. Everett stopped. He had heard many versions of his wife's voice over 19 years. The easy laugh that came up from somewhere deep, the firm, controlled tone she used when she was managing a situation, the soft, careful voice she used with their son when he was small and sick and frightened. This was none of those. This was something raw, something he had not heard before. Before we go any further, if this story is finding you for the first time, this channel is exactly what it sounds like. Real stories. The kind that cost something. The kind that take you apart and put you back together slightly different than before. Hit subscribe. Because this one is not finished yet. Adelaide's voice came through the gap again. I can't fall apart right now, Brenda. I can't. The boys are handling the estate, and if I'm not sharp, they're going to cut me out entirely. I have to hold it together until the paperwork goes through. Everett stood completely still in the hallway. Brenda was Adelaide's older sister. They had spoken every Sunday for as long as Everett had known her. But the calls had been increasing. Adelaide would end them the moment he walked into a room. He had noticed. He had told himself it meant nothing. No, Everett doesn't know. He can't know yet. If he finds out what Dad actually left behind, he's going to want to intervene. And I can't let anyone intervene, not until I understand what I'm dealing with. The letter in his jacket pocket felt very heavy. He backed away from the door, walked quietly to the living room, and sat down on the couch in the dark, in his coat, without turning on a single light. 11 months of carefully constructed suspicion rearranged itself inside him in the span of about 30 seconds. This was not what he had thought it was. He had thought, and he was not proud of what he had thought, that the distance had something to do with another person. The late nights, the ended phone calls, the way she flinched slightly when he reached for her hand and then covered it with a joke or a redirect. He had built an entire theory out of fragments and silence, the way a man will when the woman he loves stops letting him in and gives him no explanation for why. He had been wrong. He did not yet know what he was dealing with, but he knew, with the same instinct that told him when a structure was load-bearing and when it was decorative, that the thing Adelaide had been carrying alone for 11 months was not a betrayal. It was something she had decided, for reasons he did not yet understand, to protect him from. He would not confront her tonight. He needed to understand the full dimensions before he touched anything. Stay right where you are. Because what Everett learns in the next 48 hours will reframe every assumption he has made about this marriage. To understand how a man ends up sitting in his own living room in the dark, holding a letter that was supposed to end his marriage, you have to go back to where the silence actually started. 11 months earlier, the Colston household in Raleigh, North Carolina, had been unremarkable in the best possible way. Everett was in the middle of a large commercial renovation project downtown, the kind of job that came along once every few years and validated everything he had built. Their younger son, Marcus, was finishing his junior year at NC State. Their older son, Derek, had been married 2 years and was living in Charlotte with his wife and a baby that had recently learned to pull itself to standing and treat every piece of furniture as a personal climbing wall. Adelaide ran her own bookkeeping practice from home. She had built it from nothing over 12 years, starting with 2 small business clients and growing it to the point where she had a waiting list. Everett had always admired that about her, the quiet, methodical ambition, the way she made it look effortless even when he knew it wasn't. That January, her father passed away. Gerald Thornton had been 81. The death itself was not unexpected. He had been declining for 2 years and had spent his final months in a facility outside Greensboro. Adelaide had made the drive every other week without complaint, even when it cost her. The grief, when it came, was the contained kind. Adelaide held things together at the funeral with the steady grace of a woman who had been preparing for a loss and was determined to carry it with dignity. 2 weeks after the burial, her manner changed, not dramatically, not in the kind of way that announces itself, subtly, the way a change in air pressure announces a coming storm to someone who has learned to read the sky. The long Sunday calls with Brenda that she took in the other room, the way she had started keeping a second phone, a simple prepaid thing she'd said was for work overflow, face down on her desk at all times. The evenings she spent on her laptop with the screen angled away from the door. Everett asked once, early on. She said the estate was complicated and she didn't want to burden him while the downtown project was in full swing. He had accepted that. He had a way of accepting things he should have pressed on, a habit formed over years of believing that the people he loved most would tell him what he needed to know when they were ready. That habit cost him. By month 4, the physical distance had widened into something he could feel like a change in temperature. She stopped reaching for his hand in the evenings, stopped telling him the small things she used to tell him. What Brenda said, what the difficult client had done this time, what she'd read that week that had stayed with her. The easy, inconsequential conversation that fills the space between 2 people who have chosen each other every day for nearly 2 decades went quiet. Their son Marcus noticed first. He was home for a weekend in March and found his father eating alone in the kitchen. On a Saturday evening, Adelaide presumably in the office with the door closed. "Everything okay?" Marcus asked, setting his bag down in the doorway. Everett looked at his son. The boy had Adelaide's eyes, always had. "Just working through some things," he said. Marcus sat down across from him and didn't say anything else, but the question stayed in the room for the rest of the weekend. What Everett was experiencing had a name. In family psychology, it is called ambiguous loss, a term developed by researcher Dr. Pauline Boss to describe the particular grief of losing someone who has not actually left. The person is still present, still sleeping in the same bed, still sitting across the dinner table, still answering when spoken to, but the emotional availability that made the relationship feel like a relationship has disappeared. And because there is no clear cause and no clear event to point to, the grieving partner cannot process the loss through normal channels. Instead, the mind does what it always does in the absence of information. it invents explanations. And the explanations the mind invents are almost always worse than the truth. For Everett, the invented explanation had taken root around month 5 and grown quietly and steadily until it occupied most of the available space in his thinking. He told himself he had no proof. He told himself he was projecting. He told himself that Adelaide Colston, the woman who had picked up and moved to a smaller house without complaint, when the business nearly went under in 2011, the woman who had sat with him through his mother's last weeks without being asked, was not the kind of woman who would do the thing he was thinking she was doing. He told himself all of those things, and then he lay awake at 3 in the morning doing math on phone records he wasn't proud of having looked at. By September, he had made an appointment with a family attorney, not because he was certain, because uncertainty, held alone for long enough, eventually becomes its own kind of verdict. Now, sitting in the dark living room in his coat, with the letter folded in his pocket, the verdict was being appealed. He did not go to bed that night. He sat until the reading room light went off down the hall, then waited another hour, then made himself a cup of coffee, and sat at the kitchen table and thought through what he knew and what he didn't know and what he was going to do next. He was a man who fixed things before they broke. But a man could not fix something without first understanding exactly what was damaged and how. He went to work the next morning at his regular time. He came home at his regular time. He said nothing about what he had heard. He watched Adelaide move through the kitchen that evening, with the particular careful efficiency she had adopted over the past months. Every motion slightly more deliberate than it needed to be, like someone managing a resource she couldn't afford to waste. After dinner, after she had gone back to the office and closed the door, Everett sat down and called Brenda. He and Brenda had always gotten along, not with the uncomplicated warmth of people who had chosen each other, but with the solid earned mutual respect of two people who loved the same woman and had decided early on that that was reason enough. Brenda picked up on the second ring. "I need you to tell me what's going on with Adelaide," he said. "No preamble, and I need you to tell me the truth." There was a long silence on the other end. "Everett." Brenda's voice was careful, measured, the voice of someone deciding in real time how much weight to put down. "I heard part of her call last night," he said, "enough to know the estate is involved. Enough to know she's been handling something alone for almost a year and that she made a decision not to tell me. I'm not calling you to get you in trouble with your sister. I'm calling because I need to understand what I'm dealing with." Another pause. Then Brenda exhaled slowly. "It's about what Dad left behind," she said. "What he actually left behind, which is not what any of us expected. Hold on. Because what Everett hears next will explain 11 months of silence in a way that changes everything he thought he understood about the family he married into. Gerald Thornton, it turned out, had not been the man his daughters believed him to be, not in the ways that might first come to mind. He had been a decent father, present and consistent, the kind of man who showed up to recitals and graduations and sat in hospital waiting rooms without being asked. He had built a modest, honest life as a machinist in Greensboro for 40 years. He had raised 2 daughters after their mother left when they were small. He had, by every visible measure, done the work. But Gerald had also, over the course of his adult life, accumulated a second financial life that his daughters had known nothing about. A small rental property in Durham, purchased in the 1980s and never mentioned. A savings account at a credit union across town, separate from the account his daughters knew about, with a balance that had grown quietly for decades. And, most significantly, a will that had been updated 8 months before his death by an attorney Adelaide had never heard of, with provisions that left 40% of the total estate, including the Durham property, to a half-brother that Adelaide and Brenda had not known existed, a man named Curtis, 63 years old, living in Fayetteville. Gerald's son from a relationship that predated their mother by several years, and that Gerald had apparently never disclosed to anyone in his family. Adelaide found out the day the estate attorney called, Brenda said. 4 days after Dad was buried. She went to the first meeting alone because she thought it was routine. She came out of that office with the news that her father had a son she'd never known about and that this man was entitled to nearly half of everything Dad owned. Everett sat at the kitchen table and said nothing for a moment. Why didn't she tell me? Because she was ashamed, Brenda said quietly. Not of her father, of herself. She said she felt like a fool for not knowing. Like if she told you, she would have to watch you, try not to look at her differently. You know how she is. He did know how she was. That was precisely the problem. And she didn't trust the situation to stay contained. Brenda continued. Curtis has 2 adult sons. They'd hired a separate attorney. Adelaide thought if you got involved, it would escalate. She wanted to negotiate quietly, settle the estate without conflict, and present you with the resolution instead of the crisis. She was protecting me, Everett said. He wasn't sure if it was a question. She was protecting herself, Brenda said honestly. And you. And the image of her father, all 3 at once. You know Adelaide. She doesn't do anything for one reason. He sat with that for a long time after he hung up. There is a pattern that family therapists call the protector trap. It occurs when a person who loves deeply and has been shaped by a particular kind of family history, one in which difficulty was managed internally, where asking for help was indistinguishable from admitting weakness, decides that the most loving thing they can offer is the management of a crisis before anyone else has to feel it. From the inside, this feels like competence. It feels like devotion. It feels like the highest form of partnership, handling the hard thing so the person you love doesn't have to. What it looks like from the outside is a closed door. Adelaide Thornton had grown up watching her mother leave, and her father absorb it without a single visible crack. Gerald Thornton had continued working, continued parenting, continued presenting a stable and reliable face to the world, while whatever he felt about his wife's departure went somewhere else, somewhere interior and sealed, where it apparently lived for the rest of his life. Adelaide had learned to manage difficulty the same way, internally, completely, alone. She had learned it so well that when the single most destabilizing piece of information of her adult life arrived, the discovery that her father was not entirely the man she had believed him to be, her first instinct was not to reach for her husband. It was to build a perimeter, to contain the damage, to understand every dimension of the problem before anyone who mattered could see her not understanding it. And what that looked like to Everett, from the outside of a closed door for 11 months, was abandonment. He went to bed that night and lay beside his wife in the dark and did not sleep. At some point past midnight, Adelaide's breathing steadied into the slow rhythm of exhaustion, finally overtaking vigilance. He listened to it for a long time. In the morning, he asked her to sit down with him at the kitchen table before she started work. She came in with her coffee and looked at him across the kitchen counter. Something moved across her face. Not quite fear, something older than fear. The look of a person who has been managing a situation so precisely for so long that the prospect of losing control of it is worse than the situation itself. She sat down. I know about the estate, he said. His voice was quiet and level. I know about the property in Durham and the account in Curtis. Brenda told me. Adelaide set her coffee down very carefully. Her hands did not shake, but the care with which she set it down said everything. How long have you known I was going to call her? He asked. Since last night, she said. When I heard you on the phone in the kitchen. And you didn't come out. No, why? She looked at her hands. Then she looked up at him, and for the first time in 11 months, the composure cracked. Not dramatically. A single, almost involuntary crumbling at the corners of her eyes and mouth, the expression of a person whose careful management of a situation has run out of runway. Because I didn't want you to seize me failing, she said. I have been dealing with attorneys and estate documents, and a man I've never met who shares my blood and apparently a third of my father's hidden life for almost a year, and I have not been able to fix it. I couldn't present you with a resolution. I only had a crisis, and I couldn't make myself come to you with only a crisis." Everett looked at her for a long moment. "Adelaide," he said, "you have been my wife for 19 years. I know. You sat with me when we nearly lost the business. You didn't leave. You didn't protect yourself. You stayed in it with me. That was different. How?" She pressed both hands flat on the table. "Because that was your crisis. I knew how to be useful to you in it. This one," she stopped, pressed her lips together. "This one made me feel foolish, like I had been trusting a version of my father that was not entirely real. And I couldn't figure out how to tell you that the family you married into had a secret none of us knew about. I was embarrassed, and I knew if I told you, you would want to help. And I wasn't ready to be helped. I just needed to get to the other side of it first." The kitchen was quiet. Everett reached across the table and put his hand over both of hers. She looked down at it. Then she looked up at him, and the tears came, not the controlled, silent kind she'd probably been allowing herself in private, but the other kind. The kind that come when the effort of holding something back finally exceeds the capacity to hold it. Has someone you love ever tried to protect you by disappearing from you? Drop your response below. Or simply say, "Stayed," or "didn't understand until it was too late." He didn't pull her across the table. He didn't say anything for a while. He just kept his hand over hers and let her get through it. When she had steadied, he told her about the letter. He took it out of his jacket pocket. He had been wearing the same jacket since Tuesday, and he unfolded it and set it on the table between them without saying anything. She read it in silence. When she finished, she set it down and stared at the wall for a long moment. "You were that close," she said. "Yes," she pressed her hand over her mouth. "Everett, I'm so sorry. I thought I was protecting you. I know that, but I almost lost you trying to." "I know that too. Let's step outside for a moment, because what just happened at that kitchen table illustrates something that family psychology documents with painful consistency. When one partner in a marriage manages a crisis privately, the cost is rarely limited to themselves. The other partner, deprived of information and explanation, does not simply wait patiently in an emotional neutral state until the managing partner is ready to share. They do what human beings always do in the absence of information. They fill the gap. They construct a story. And the story they construct is almost always built from the most available material, their own fears. Everett's fear, the fear that had been quietly compounding for 11 months, was that he was losing Adelaide to something or someone beyond his reach, that the life they had built was quietly concluding without his knowledge or consent. He had been right about the concluding, wrong about everything else. The particular cruelty of this pattern, which therapists sometimes call the silent management cycle, is that both partners are operating from love and both are suffering, and neither one can see that the other person's behavior is a direct response to their own. Adelaide's silence made Everett withdraw into suspicion. Everett's quiet watchfulness made Adelaide feel observed and managed rather than supported, which deepened her instinct to conceal. Each person's response to the other was widening the exact distance they were both afraid of. They had been doing this to each other for nearly a year, in the same house, at the same table, neither one knowing. That evening, Adelaide opened the estate file on her laptop and walked Everett through it for the first time. Every document, every letter, the initial attorney's call, the updated will, the contact information for Curtis, who had, it turned out, reached out to Adelaide twice in the preceding months, both times requesting a direct conversation, both times being deflected by her attorney on Adelaide's instructions. "Did you read his letters?" Everett asked. She opened a separate folder and turned the laptop so he could see. He read them slowly. Curtis had not written like a man who wanted something. He had written like a man who was also trying to understand something. He had not known, he said, that Gerald had 2 daughters. He had not known much of anything about his biological father's life. Gerald had provided financial support when Curtis was a child, but had never been part of his life in any other meaningful way. Curtis was not contesting the estate out of greed. He was exercising a legal right and, beneath the formal language, clearly trying to understand why a man who had been a stranger to him his entire life had thought to include him at all. "He just wants to know where he came from," Everett said. Adelaide didn't say anything. "You already knew that," he said. "Yes," she said quietly. "And it scared you." She looked at the table. "He's my father's son. My father had a whole piece of his life that none of us knew about. If I sit down with Curtis, I have to look at that directly. I have to accept that the man I have been grieving for was more complicated than I understood him to be." Her voice was steady, but only barely. "I wasn't ready for that." Everett closed the laptop gently. "You don't have to be ready alone," he said. She looked up at him. "I'm here," he said. "I have always been here. That's the part I need you to understand. Not that you should have told me sooner, though you should have. But that I am not someone you need to manage your pain around. You are allowed to not have the answer when you come to me. I don't need you to come to me already fixed." This is the moment that family therapists most want to document and most rarely get to see clearly. The moment when the demand-withdraw cycle breaks, not through confrontation or ultimatum, but through one person naming, without anger, the thing that the other person's silence had been costing them. And the other person hearing it not as blame, but as the most specific kind of love. The love that says, "I want to know where you actually are." Adelaide reached across the table. Everett took her hand. 3 days later, he drove with her to Fayetteville. Curtis met them at a diner off the highway. He was a large, quiet man with Gerald Thornton's mouth and none of his daughter's eyes, which Adelaide registered immediately and then didn't know what to do with. He ordered coffee. He thanked them for coming. He said he had not expected them to come. The conversation lasted 2 hours. It covered things that conversations like this rarely cover the first time. What Curtis had known growing up, what Gerald had said in the single phone call he had initiated the year before he died, what it had meant to each of them to lose a man they had known so differently. At some point, Adelaide cried, which was not something she had planned to do. Curtis handed her a paper napkin across the table with the matter-of-fact gentleness of a man who had also been working out how to feel about all of this. "He wasn't a bad man," Curtis said. "He was a complicated man. I stopped waiting for him to be something else a long time ago." Adelaide looked at her coffee. "How did you manage that?" "I had to separate what I wanted him to be from what he actually was," Curtis said. "That's not easy to do for somebody you love, but it's the only honest thing." On the drive home, Adelaide was quiet for a long time. Then she said, without looking away from the window, "I've been grieving a man who didn't entirely exist." "You've been grieving the father you knew," Everett said. "He was real. The love was real. The rest is just. The rest is something you make room for." She turned to look at him. "When did you get like this?" she said. "I had 11 months of practice thinking in the dark," he said. She laughed. It was a small, startled, entirely genuine laugh. The first real laugh he had heard from her in almost a year. He kept his eyes on the road, but he reached across the center console and took her hand. "Now, let's step outside for a moment, because what happened in that diner illustrates something that grief researchers have documented with increasing precision over the past 2 decades. Complicated grief, the kind that arrives alongside the discovery that the person being mourned was not entirely who we believed them to be, presents a unique psychological obstacle. It is not simply grief for a lost person. It is grief for a lost understanding. The mourner must simultaneously process the death and revise the relationship, reconciling the love they felt with the complexity of the person they loved. This is harder than ordinary grief because it requires releasing 2 things at once: the person and the version of the person. What Adelaide had been attempting to do, alone for 11 months, was one of the more demanding psychological tasks a person can undertake, and what she had not understood, what most people in the protector trap do not understand, is that carrying that kind of weight in isolation does not make the person stronger. It makes the load heavier. Because the full weight of a complicated thing is always lighter when it is divided. Everett had always known that. He had just not understood that Adelaide needed to hear him say it explicitly. Some things, it turns out, you have to learn how to offer, because the people you love most have sometimes spent their whole lives learning not to ask. When they got home, Marcus was in the kitchen, having driven up from Raleigh without much explanation, which was something he did periodically. As though he operated on a separate frequency that detected when the family needed another body in the room without being able to articulate why. He looked at the two of them when they came in through the kitchen door. Something shifted in his face. The careful, watchful quality that had been there since March relaxed, not completely, but perceptibly. The way a room feels different after a window is opened. "You guys eat?" he said. "No," Adelaide said. "I'll make something," Marcus said, and turned back to the refrigerator. Everett sat down at the kitchen table. Adelaide sat across from him. Neither of them said anything, but the silence, for the first time in 11 months, was not the silence of two people performing normalcy at a careful distance. It was the other kind. The kind that happens when nothing needs to be said because the things that needed saying have been said. Marcus made scrambled eggs and toast, which was the extent of his cooking range, and set the plates down without ceremony. They ate together. There is a final principle worth naming here, because it applies to what this family chose to do in the months that followed. It is called earned security, a concept from attachment research that describes the process by which two people who have experienced rupture in a close relationship repair it not through the erasure of the rupture, but through the deliberate, repeated choice to be honest about it. Earned security is not the restoration of the way things were before. It is something more difficult and more durable than that. It is the relationship that two people build after they have both understood, at real cost, what the relationship is actually worth. Everett and Adelaide began attending marriage counseling in January, 4 months after the night in the dark living room. Not because the marriage was in crisis. The crisis had passed. They went because they were both practical enough to understand that a thing repaired without inspection is a thing waiting to fail again. The counselor was a woman out of Durham named Dr. Felice Okafor, who had the particular gift of asking the exact question that made both of them uncomfortable in useful ways. In one of the early sessions, she asked Adelaide what it would mean to need Everett's help. Adelaide sat with the question for a long time. "It would mean admitting I can't manage everything," she finally said. "And what does that cost you?" Adelaide looked at her hands. "It feels like becoming a burden." Dr. Okafor looked at Everett. "Is she a burden?" "No," he said without pausing. "Tell her why." Everett turned to his wife. "Because a burden is something you carry in spite of yourself. You're someone I choose every day. There's no weight in that. There's only the choice." Adelaide looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, very quietly, "I'm going to have to practice believing that." "I know," he said. "I'll be here while you do." They settled the estate in the spring. Curtis received his share without litigation. Adelaide and Brenda reached an understanding with their half-brother that was not warm, exactly, but was honest, built on the shared acknowledgement that Gerald Thornton had been imperfect and beloved and now gone, and that they were all navigating the same complicated aftermath from different directions. Curtis sent a card when the paperwork concluded. Adelaide read it twice and set it on the kitchen windowsill next to the cedar candle. She left it there. The Durham rental property was sold in April. Everett helped coordinate the contractors, which he did not have to do, and which Adelaide received without arguing, which was its own small act of progress. The letter that had been in his jacket pocket was gone. He had torn it up the morning after the kitchen conversation. Not ceremonially, not in front of anyone, just torn it up over the recycling bin in the garage, the way you dispose of something that has served its purpose and has no further use. Adelaide knew about it. They had talked about what it had taken for him to write it and what it had cost him to walk through the door carrying it. Neither of them looked away from that conversation. That was new. That was something they had built. In June, they drove to Charlotte for the weekend to see Derek and his wife and the grandchild, who had, by now, graduated from pulling himself to standing, to launching himself off furniture with the confidence of someone who has not yet learned about consequences. The four of them sat on Derek's back porch on a Saturday evening with cold drinks while the baby investigated a garden hose with serious scientific interest. "You two seem different," Derek said, looking between his parents in the way adult children look at their parents when something has shifted and they can't quite locate the source. "We're working on some things," Everett said. Derek glanced at his wife, then back at his father. "Good different," he said. Adelaide reached across the porch chair and took Everett's hand. "Yes," she said. The drive home that Sunday was 4 hours. They talked for most of it. Not about the estate or the counseling or the 11 months. They talked the way they used to. The easy, inconsequential, unhurried way of two people who have known each other long enough that silence is optional and filling it is a pleasure rather than a performance. They talked about Marcus and whether he was actually happy in his program or performing contentment. They talked about whether to expand the back porch before winter. Adelaide said she had been thinking about taking on a part-time associate for the bookkeeping practice, which was something she had been considering for 3 years but had never quite committed to. "What's stopping you?" Everett asked. "I don't know," she said. "I think I'm used to managing things alone." She said it lightly. But they both heard the other thing in it. "You don't have to be," he said. "I'm practicing," she said. He reached across the center console. She took his hand. 2 weeks later, on a Tuesday evening in late August, Everett came home from a job site to find the kitchen smelling like something Adelaide hadn't cooked in years. Her mother's gumbo recipe, the one she'd said she'd never attempted because the standard it had to meet was impossible. The table was set. There was bread from the bakery on Hillsborough Street. There was music on, low, coming from the old speaker in the corner that they kept meaning to replace. He stood in the kitchen doorway. "What's the occasion?" he said. Adelaide was at the stove. She turned to look at him over her shoulder. "No occasion," she said. "I just wanted to come home." He set his keys down on the counter, looked at the table, at the candle she'd lit, at the woman standing at the stove in the kitchen of the house they had almost lost to a silence both of them had helped build. "So did I," he said, and that, it turned out, was enough. More than enough. The kind of enough that takes years to build and silence to nearly destroy and honesty to restore. The kind that holds not because nothing ever cracked, but because two people chose, when it mattered most, to repair it together.